In August 1878, the high valley of Rendezvous Creek, Utah Territory, crackled with an electric yellow light. The air was thick enough to chew. Seasoned trappers, men who read the sky like a book, saw the anvil-shaped clouds rolling in from the south and began to scramble. Elias Thorne, a bushway with 3 men in his employ, barked orders, his team dragging hundreds of cured beaver and marten pelts into their heavy canvas Sibley tents. They deepened the small 4-inch spit trenches around their camp, trusting the 12-ounce duck canvas that had cost them a small fortune in St. Louis. 50 yards away, on a slight, almost imperceptible rise, Silas Vane did nothing. His pelts were already stored, not in a tent, but on high racks inside a flimsy-looking open-sided pole shed. As Thorne's men raced against the first fat drops of rain, Vane was calmly inspecting a series of small, seemingly random logs laid in the dirt uphill from his camp. When the sky opened, it was not a rain. It was a deluge. The hardpan ground, baked solid by a month of sun, refused to absorb the water. Within 10 minutes, a 2-inch sheet of water was racing downhill. At Thorne's camp, it was a catastrophe. The small trench overflowed instantly, the water flooding under the tent walls, soaking the priceless pelts stacked on the ground. Worse, the high-velocity drops hitting the saturated earth created a fine, muddy spray that blasted the bottom 18 inches of every stack. At Vane's camp, the sheet flow hit the first angled log barrier, shunted sideways, and vanished into a gravel-filled ditch. The ground inside his defenseless open-air shed remained bone dry. When the storm passed, Elias Thorne had lost 40% of his season's work to rot. Silas Vane lost nothing. What did this quiet, methodical trapper understand about the physics of water that his experienced, successful peers had completely missed? The year was 1878, and the great North American fur trade, while decades past its peak, was still a viable, if brutal, way of life in the high Rockies. Utah Territory was a land of extremes. Winters were bone-chilling, requiring thick log shelters and massive stockpiles of wood, but summers were defined by a relentless, desiccating heat. The men who gathered at Rendezvous Creek were nomads of a sort, emerging from a winter of trapping to trade their "plue" with factors from the big St. Louis and Canadian fur companies. The conventional wisdom of the high desert trapper was built around fighting snow, ice, and drought. Rain was seen as a brief, rare blessing. The book on setting a summer camp, passed down by word of mouth from men like Jim Bridger and Jedediah Smith, was simple. Pitch your tent on flat ground near the water source for easy access, and make sure your canvas is tight. For preserving pelts, the standard was a military-style Sibley tent or, for a semi-permanent camp, a dugout, a cave dug into a hillside, roofed with timbers and sod. These methods were fast, required minimal labor, and worked 95% of the time. The entire culture was focused on the trap, the skinning knife, and the rifle. The engineering of a camp was an afterthought, a temporary inconvenience. This reliance on what always worked created a systemic, shared vulnerability that no one could see. They were all building for the 95%, forgetting that in the mountains the other 5% arrives with the force of a locomotive, and it is the 5% event that determines who lives and who dies, who gets rich, and who walks away with nothing but the clothes on his back. Silas Vane was perhaps the only man at Rendezvous Creek who built for the 5%. Elias Thorne was the living embodiment of the conventional method. He was successful, arrogant, and efficient. His operation was a model of 19th-century frontier industry. He had 2 18-foot Sibley tents, purchased from a supplier in St. Louis for $45 apiece, a significant capital investment. The canvas was 12-ounce, treated with linseed oil, and waterproof against any direct rainfall. He pitched them on a perfectly flat, broad clearing about 50 yards from the creek's summer bank. It was convenient, spacious, and identical to the setups recommended in military manuals. Inside these tents, he and his partners had stacked their winter's haul, 450 prime beaver pelts, stretched on willow hoops, and over 800 marten skins. The total value, if delivered dry to the company factor, was north of $3,000. a staggering sum. When the August 12th storm hit, Thorne's system failed not in one way, but in three distinct, catastrophic phases. The first failure was the Spit Trench. The 4-inch deep, 6-inch wide ditch was designed to stop a slow trickle of water on absorbent ground. The monsoonal burst delivered 3 inches of rain in under an hour onto hardpan clay. The infiltration rate was near zero. The trench was overwhelmed in 60 seconds by a 2-inch deep, 50-yard wide sheet flow that swept across the flat. The second failure was the ground-level storage. The water pooled inside the tent, saturating the bottom layer of pelts. The cured leather, which must remain perfectly dry, was rehydrated. The third and most insidious failure was splashback. The high-velocity raindrops hammering the saturated ground created a fine, high-pressure mist of mud and bacteria. This spray coated the bottom 18 inches of every single pelt stack, contaminating them. When the sun returned, Thorne and his men worked frantically, laying the pelts out to dry. But the damage was done. The leather began to slip, the hair follicles relaxed, and the fur began to pull away from the hide. Within 3 days, the unmistakable sour smell of rot hung over his camp. Silas Vane, now in his mid-50s, had not come from this arid land. He was born in the deep, damp hollers of the Appalachian Mountains in western North Carolina. He had grown up in a world defined not by a lack of water, but by its relentless, crushing excess. His primary education came from his grandfather, a subsistence farmer and miller, who had waged a lifelong tactical war against runoff. His grandfather had taught him that water is lazy but powerful. It always takes the easiest path, and a wise man doesn't try to stop it. He simply offers it an easier path. He learned to read the lay of a hill, to cut a swale, a ditch on contour, to move water gently without erosion, and how to build a spring house that used the cold flow of water to cool milk without ever flooding. Vane later spent 3 years in the Pacific Northwest near Astoria, trying his hand at logging. There, he watched mill operators build timber flumes and diversion dams, using nothing but gravity and hydraulics to move 2-ton logs. He learned that a 6-inch log placed at the correct angle could redirect forces that a 6-foot wall, placed incorrectly, would shatter against. When Vane arrived in the Utah Territory, the other trappers saw a desert. Vane saw a brittle, baked clay landscape, a flume waiting for a flood. While the others mocked him for the time he wasted gardening, he was quietly applying the principles of Appalachian water management to the high desert. His neighbors, including Elias Thorne, called his setup Vane's Folly, or the woodpile. They saw his work as eccentric, the fiddling of an old man who was too slow to get to the real work of trapping. Vane began his folly by selecting a site that every other trapper had ignored. It was 100 yards further from the creek, on a gentle but consistent 3% grade. It was inconvenient. It meant carrying heavy, wet pelts further. For 2 full days, while Thorne's men were already setting their trap lines, Vane hauled materials. His shed was a mockery of a structure. It was a simple pole shed, 4 10-foot pine posts set in the ground, with a single-pitch roof of rafters covered by a single cheap canvas tarp. It had no walls. It was completely open to the elements on all 4 sides. Thorne, passing by, had laughed. "That roof'll catch wind, Silas. And what good is a roof with no walls? The rain'll blow right in." Vane didn't bother to answer. The true innovation was invisible. First, inside the shed, he built his drying racks. He drove smaller posts into the ground and built a platform of crossbeams 3 feet above the dirt. His pelts would never, under any circumstances, touch the ground. Second, he built his log barriers. This was not a wall. 20 feet uphill from his shed, he laid a series of 6-inch diameter pine logs, end to end, for 40 feet. Crucially, they were not perpendicular to the slope. They were laid at a 30-degree angle. Third, between this log deflector and his shed, he dug a 1-foot-deep, 1-foot-wide trench, which he spent half a day filling with gravel and small stones from the creek bed. This drain was also angled, designed to catch any overflow and channel it away. To the others, his camp looked weak, unfinished, and lazy. Thorne's taut white Sibley tents looked like symbols of order and security. Vane's looked like a trash heap, but Thorne had built a fortress to fight the wind. Vane had built a flume to manage the water. The conflict was one of fundamental engineering philosophy. Elias Thorne represented the fortress model. This was a brute force approach, a belief that security comes from mass, thickness, and sealing the perimeter. He trusted his 12-ounce canvas, his tight guy lines, and his sealed tent walls. He saw the environment as an enemy to be repelled. His entire system was designed to stop water from hitting his pelts from above. This static defense was heavy, expensive, and, as the hardpan ground demonstrated, had a single catastrophic point of failure. It completely ignored the physics of hydrology. Silas Vane, by contrast, operated on the flow model. This was an intelligent, passive system of deflection. Vane knew the real enemy wasn't the rain from the sky. It was the sheet flow on the ground and the splashback from the impact. He didn't try to stop the water. He accepted its inevitability. His goal was simply to convince it to go somewhere else. The physics of his log barrier were simple. By angling it at 30 degrees, it never acted as a dam. A dam would pool water, which would then top the 6-inch log and continue on its way. Instead, the angled log acted as a plow or deflector. It intercepted the sheet flow and, using the water's own momentum, shunted it harmlessly to the side of his camp. The gravel-filled French drain was his secondary defense, an interceptor. Any water that did top the log would fall into this highly permeable trench and be carried underground, preventing the surface from ever saturating. Thorne was trying to fight the storm. Vane was partnering with gravity. 2 days after the storm, Mr. Julian Abernathy, a factor for the Chouteau Fur Company, arrived at Rendezvous Creek. Abernathy was not a trapper. He was a businessman. He wore spectacles, carried a leather satchel, and his ledger was his Bible. He rode into a scene of utter chaos. Thorne's camp was a salvage operation. Pelts were spread over every available bush, steaming in the hot sun, and the faint, sour smell of rot was already present. Thorne, desperate, tried to pass them off as just a little damp from the storm. Abernathy pulled a small, brass-cased hygrometer from his satchel. He placed it against a pelt from the top of a pile. It read 18% moisture. Acceptable. He then took one from the bottom of the pile. The needle swung past 40%. He didn't even need the tool. He could feel the slip. He shook his head. He methodically walked the camp, condemning 180 of Thorne's 450 beaver pelts and nearly 300 marten skins. He marked them in his ledger. Rot slip. Grade 4. No value. Thorne was apoplectic, his $2,500 loss materializing before his eyes. Abernathy, ignoring the protests, walked the 100 yards to Vane's folly. He was skeptical of the primitive-looking setup. Vane quietly pulled a pelt from the 3-foot-high rack. Abernathy inspected it. It was stiff, dry, and clean. He pressed the hygrometer to it. It read 12% moisture. He tried another. 11%. He scraped his boot on the ground under the racks. A small puff of dust rose. It was bone dry. Abernathy, the man of numbers, stood stunned for a moment. He looked at the devastation at Thorne's camp, then at the perfect preservation at Vane's. He turned his attention to the simple log berm and the gravel ditch. He made a meticulous note in his ledger. Camp 1, Thorne. Loss, 40%. Camp 2, Vane. Loss, 0%. He then asked Vane, "How long did this take you?" Vane shrugged. 2 days, before I set my traps. Vane's folly was not a barrier. It was a 5-part passive water management system. Layer 1 was site selection. The 3% grade was non-negotiable. It ensured that gravity, not pooling, would dictate the water's behavior. Layer 2 was the deflection berm, the log barrier. This 40-foot-long, 8-inch-high berm was the primary defense, angled at 30 degrees to the slope. It was designed not to stop the water, but to trip it and use its own velocity to sluice it sideways. It was a $5 solution, in terms of labor, to a $5,500 problem. Layer 3 was the interception trench, the French drain. Positioned 10 feet downhill from the berm, this 1 foot deep, 1 foot wide gravel-filled ditch served as the secondary defense. It created a high permeability void. Any water that topped the berm lost its velocity and fell into this trench, flowing through the stones under the surface rather than over it. This kept the ground pressure high and dry. Layer 4 was the elevated racks. This was the defense against splashback. Thorn's pelts, stacked on the ground, were in the 18-inch splash zone. Vanes, at 3 feet, were safely above the mud and spray. Layer 5 was the ventilated roof. The open-sided shed, which Thorn had mocked, was the system's lungs. After the storm, the ambient humidity was 100%. Thorn's sealed Sibley tents became humidors, trapping the moisture and accelerating rot. Vane's open shed allowed the slightest breeze to create constant convection, actively wicking moisture from the hides. The system was a masterpiece of physics, redundant and elegant, using the storm's own energy against itself. Abernathy was still in the valley 4 days later, auditing smaller camps, when the second storm hit. This one was not a burst, it was a stall. A massive system stalled over the canyon and unleashed a 1-in-100-year event. An estimated 5 inches of rain fell in 2 hours. This time, Rendezvous Creek left its banks. It wasn't sheet flow anymore. It was a genuine 6-foot flood. Thorn's tents, which he had left pitched, were simply washed away. The flat ground he had chosen was now under 3 feet of raging brown water. 3 men in a camp downstream were lost, tangled in their own tent ropes. At Vane's compound, the scene was one of terrible, awesome physics. The floodwaters from the creek never reached his high ground, but the runoff from the hillside above was a waterfall. Vane, Thorn, who had moved his salvaged pelts nearby, and Abernathy watched from Vane's shed. The deflection berm was completely overwhelmed in seconds. It was too much volume. But Layer 3, the French drain, engaged. The gravel trench swallowed a massive amount of water, absorbing its kinetic energy. It, too, was eventually overwhelmed, but the water that sheeted past it was now slowed, moving at a crawl, only half an inch deep. This gentle flow reached the shed and passed harmlessly under the 3-foot-high racks. It flowed beneath their feet, out the other side, and rejoined the main flood. Vane's pelts, and Thorn's salvaged ones, were completely untouched. Abernathy, the man from St. Louis, stood on the dry racks, watching the water flow beneath him, dumbfounded. The system had worked, even when its primary defense failed. The storm broke at dusk, revealing a valley of total devastation. By nightfall, 10 survivors, including Thorn, his partners, and Abernathy, had gathered at Vane's camp. It was the only dry, safe ground in the lower valley. Vane's pelt shed, designed for furs, became a refugee center, but the open-sided shed, while dry, was cold. The temperature had plummeted to 45 degrees Fahrenheit, 7 degrees. The group, wet and shivering, needed a fire. But a fire near the pelts was a massive risk. Vane, the engineer, became the camp manager. He designated a fire pit 30 yards downwind of the shed and rationed his own dry wood. He established a 2-man watch to manage the fire and monitor the still-rising creek. Here, Abernathy, the man of the book, became the second in command. He took out his ledger and began an inventory. Who was present? What supplies? Food, ammunition, dry blankets. Did they have collectively? Who was missing? The 2 men, Vane, the man of Appalachian physics, and Abernathy, the man of St. Louis accounting, formed an unlikely team. They managed the small, cold, and terrified group for 36 hours, imposing discipline and order until the floodwaters receded, and the true cost, in lives and property, could be tallied. The 1878 Rendezvous Creek disaster became a quiet legend, not among the press, but within the ledgers of the Chouteau Fur Company. Abernathy's final report to St. Louis was not a story, but an after-action report. The statistics were stark. Total trappers in valley, 14. Total value of pelts, pre-storm, est. $8,500. Total value lost, esters $5,000, over 58%. Lives lost, 3. Performance of vein system, 0% pelt loss, 0% asset loss. Abernathy's report included a detailed hand-drawn diagram of the vein system, which he described as the angled deflection berm and gravel drain. The company took immediate notice. They issued new guidelines to their factors, authorizing them to offer a bonus, a higher price per pelt, for any trapper who built and used vein-style storage. They realized that protecting the supply chain from the 5% event was just as important as the trapping itself. Elias Thorne, humbled and bankrupt, was the first convert. He reportedly spent the next winter working for Vane, learning how to read a slope. The next year, at that same rendezvous, there were 3 camps built on the 3% grade, each with its own angled berm. Years later, by 1885, the fur trade had all but vanished from Utah. The valley at Rendezvous Creek was now home to a few small homesteads. The landscape itself held the legacy. One ranch house, built on a slight rise 200 yards from the creek, stood as a testament. It was a sturdy log cabin, but 50 feet uphill, a long, low, grassed-over berm angled across the slope, guiding water away from the foundation. Around the house itself was a deep, 2-foot-wide drip line filled with river gravel. The folly had become the foundation. The disaster had tested 2 competing frontiers. One was the frontier of brute force, the belief that man could conquer the wilderness with a thicker wall or a stronger tent. That idea was heavy, expensive, and fragile. The other, Vane's frontier, was one of quiet observation and passive engineering. It was a wisdom born in the damp, ancient mountains of Appalachia, a wisdom that understood you don't fight a flood. You simply offer it a more attractive path. In a land where men died fearing the lack of water, Silas Vane had survived and prospered because he was the only one who truly respected its power.